The morning the engines would not start. At 4:37 on the morning of December 24, 1944, at an Allied forward airstrip in eastern France, a maintenance sergeant stood under the open cowling of a fighter aircraft while the cold worked its way through his gloves. The field was still dark. Not completely black. There was a thin grayness over the snow, the kind that came just before dawn, when shapes became visible but faces did not. Aircraft sat in their revetments like sleeping animals, their wings edged with frost, their tires half sunk into frozen mud. Somewhere beyond the field, artillery rolled in slow waves. Not close enough to stop the morning. Close enough to remind every man there that the war had not paused for Christmas Eve. The sergeant had not slept much. Few of them had. His hands were stiff from cold and oil. His flashlight beam shook slightly as he leaned into the engine compartment. The pilot stood a few feet away in his flying gear, collar up, helmet under one arm, trying not to look impatient. Behind them, trucks moved without headlights. Armorers loaded ammunition belts. Fuel crews dragged hoses across the ground. In the operations tent, a map was already marked with the day's route. The aircraft was supposed to fly in less than an hour. It looked ready. That was the dangerous part. The machine had fuel. It had ammunition. It had a pilot. It had orders. Its squadron had been told to get into the air as soon as weather and light allowed. German forces had broken through in the Ardennes days earlier, and every available aircraft mattered. Fighter bombers were needed to hit roads, bridges, columns, anything that moved under the low winter sky. But the engine had coughed during the first start. Not failed loudly. Not exploded. Nothing dramatic enough for a film. It had simply refused to sound right. A rough note. A hesitation. A rhythm just uneven enough for a tired mechanic to hear. The pilot had heard it too, though he did not say so at first. Pilots knew engines by fear. Mechanics knew them by habit. The difference mattered. The sergeant removed a small part from the ignition system and held it near the flashlight. A spark plug, fouled and darkened, its ceramic body stained, its metal threads marked by heat and use. Small enough to disappear in a coat pocket. Cheap compared to the aircraft around it. Too ordinary to look like a weapon. Yet the entire machine waited on it. The belief at headquarters was simple enough. Air power was counted in aircraft. A squadron had a number. A group had a number. A wing had a number. Reports moved upward with columns and totals. Aircraft assigned, aircraft operational, sorties planned, sorties flown. On paper, strength looked clean. On the ground, it was never clean. A fighter did not become air power because it existed. It became air power only when every invisible piece agreed to work at the same time. Plugs, leads, magnetos, fuel pumps, hydraulic lines, oxygen bottles, tires, guns, radios, batteries, oil, coolant, and men with cold fingers trying to keep all of it alive. The pilot stepped closer. "Can she go?" The sergeant did not answer immediately. He turned the plug in his hand. He looked at the engine. He looked toward the line of aircraft beyond them, where other mechanics were having the same kind of morning. The sound across the field was not the clean roar of a squadron waking up. It was uneven. One engine caught. Another died. A third backfired, sharp and flat, and someone shouted in the darkness. They had believed the enemy would be waiting in the sky. But what really happened was that the first battle of the day was being fought in the engine cowling, before a single will left the ground. And as the sergeant reached for his tool roll, he already knew the worst possibility. It was not one bad plug. It was that the parts bin might be empty. The great illusion of air power. From a distance, air power looked like certainty. In wartime photographs, it arrived information. Rows of bombers crossing the clouds, fighters banking toward the sun, aircraft factories stretching into the horizon, workers riveting wings beneath bright factory lights. To civilians, aircraft meant modern war at its most advanced. To commanders, they meant reach, speed, pressure, and the ability to strike beyond the old limits of trenches and roads. The language around them was grand. Strategic bombing, air superiority, interdiction, close support, deep penetration, fighter sweeps. The words made war sound controlled. A commander standing over a map could draw an arrow from an airfield to a rail junction, from a bomber base to an oil refinery, from a carrier deck to an island runway. The aircraft was assumed to be available. The pilot was assumed to be ready. The mission was assumed to begin when the order was given. But air war had a private truth, and it did not live on maps. It lived in the gap between aircraft assigned and aircraft serviceable. A squadron might have 24 fighters on strength. That did not mean 24 fighters could fly. Some were undergoing scheduled inspection. Some needed engine work. Some had taken damage on the previous mission. Some waited for tires. Some waited for oxygen equipment. Some had radios that failed in cold weather. Some were missing a part no one outside maintenance had thought about until it was gone. For the men planning campaigns, these were details. For the men standing in the mud, these details were the campaign. During the Second World War, every major air force fought this hidden war. The Royal Air Force fought it in damp fields and dispersal huts. The United States Army Air Forces fought it across oceans, depots, and forward strips. The Luftwaffe fought it with increasing desperation as fuel, trained men, and replacement parts became harder to find. The Soviet Air Forces fought it in weather that punished machines as severely as men. The aircraft were famous. The maintenance systems were not. Yet a fighter engine was not a symbol. It was an argument between fire, fuel, air, metal, and timing. A bomber was not a single machine but a flying collection of systems, each one capable of betraying the crew. A squadron was not 20 or 30 aircraft. It was a living organism, and like any organism, it could be weakened by something small. That was the part many leaders were slow to understand. Industrial production could build aircraft faster than the old world had imagined. America could send thousands of machines across oceans. Britain could repair and return damaged aircraft with remarkable discipline. Germany could disperse factories and continue producing aircraft under bombing. But production alone did not create operational strength. An aircraft that could not fly was inventory, not air power. This distinction grew sharper as the war went on. In 1940, an air force might be judged by its aircraft types, its pilots, its doctrine. By 1944 and 1945, the deeper question was different. How many aircraft could be kept flying day after day in bad weather, under pressure, after losses, after damage, after supply lines stretched and depots clogged and mechanics collapsed from exhaustion? The answer did not depend only on courage. It depended on systems. A pilot could be brave and still be grounded. A commander could be aggressive and still have no aircraft. A nation could build a brilliant fighter and still watch it sit useless because a bearing, pump, plug, tire, or seal was missing. This was the quiet humiliation of modern war. It took the largest factories on Earth to build an air force. But on a cold morning near the front, one man could hold in his palm the reason that Air Force could not move. They believed strength was measured by machines. What really happened was that strength was measured by readiness. And readiness was fragile. The hidden front line under the cowling. The men who kept aircraft flying rarely appeared in the heroic center of wartime memory. They were in the background of photographs, crouched beside landing gear, leaning over engines, standing on wings with rags in their pockets. Their faces were usually turned away. Their hands were always busy. They wore coveralls instead of flight jackets, grease instead of medals, and they measured danger in sounds most people could not hear. A pilot listened to an engine because his life depended on it. A mechanic listened because everyone's life depended on whether he was honest about what he heard. That was the burden. A crew chief might know an aircraft more intimately than the man who flew it. He knew which engine started reluctantly in the cold, which cylinder ran hot, which gun jammed after a hard maneuver, which hydraulic line had been patched twice already, which pilot returned with the throttle firewalled and the engine overworked. He knew the smell of burned insulation, the wrong shine of leaking fluid, the difference between normal vibration and the first hint of failure. He knew machines lied. They could look whole and be unsafe. They could pass a hurried glance and fail under climb power. They could start cleanly on the ground and betray a pilot at altitude, where cold, pressure, and fear made every weakness worse. This was why maintenance was not support in any simple sense. It was judgment under pressure. The mechanic did not only repair. He decided. Could the aircraft fly one more mission? Could the worn part last another hour? Could a damaged machine be trusted over enemy territory? Could a shortage be hidden by cleaning, swapping, improvising, cannibalizing? Could a man say no when every voice around him needed yes? The war gave these men little romance. Their hours were brutal. In the Pacific, coral dust got into everything. It worked into engines, filters, eyes, food, lungs. In North Africa, sand found places no manual had imagined. In Europe, mud swallowed tools and winter froze hands until wrenches felt like iron pulled from ice. On bomber fields in England, ground crews worked through rain and darkness to prepare aircraft for missions that might return with holes through wings, blood in the fuselage, and engines that had been pushed beyond their limits. Then they did it again. The officers spoke of sortie rates. The crews spoke of plugs, leaks, cracks, fouling, pressure, compression, timing. Neither language was wrong. One was just closer to the machine. And the machine was where theory became physical. The belief from above was that maintenance could be scheduled. There were inspections, forms, parts lists, repair depots, service intervals. There were manuals for almost everything. The system existed because it had to exist. But the battlefield did not respect schedules. Aircraft came back early, late, damaged, frozen, overheated, shot through or missing entirely. Missions changed. Weather closed in. Orders arrived at night. A squadron that expected rest might be told to fly again. An aircraft that should have been pulled from service might suddenly become necessary because others were worse. This was where the ground crew lived, between the manual and the emergency. They believed the war in the air began at takeoff. What really happened was that it began hours earlier, under lamps, in cold oil and exhaust smoke, with men too tired to speak much and too responsible to stop looking. On that morning in France, the maintenance sergeant knew all of this without needing to say it. He had learned it the way mechanics learn, through repetition, mistakes, close calls, and the sight of aircraft that did not come back. The pilot wanted an answer. The operations board wanted a number. The front wanted aircraft. The engine wanted a part. And the parts drawer, when the sergeant opened it, was almost empty. The part no one respected. A spark plug did not look like war. It had no menace in it. No barrel, no blade, no explosive charge. It did not belong on a recruiting poster. It did not make a sound until it was buried inside an engine, doing its work where no one could see it. Yet inside a high-powered aircraft engine, that small part helped decide whether fuel became motion or waste. The principle was simple enough to explain. Fuel and air entered the cylinder. The piston compressed the mixture. At the right instant, the plug fired a spark. That spark ignited the charge, and the engine turned violence into controlled power. But simple principles become fragile under war conditions. The spark had to come at the right time. The plug had to survive heat, pressure, oil, vibration, altitude, cold starts, long climbs, hard throttle changes, and the rough habits of combat flying. It had to do this not once, but again and again, across engines designed to produce astonishing power from metal pushed to its limits. Some engines used many plugs. Large radial engines and liquid-cooled V12s depended on ignition systems that could not be treated casually. One faulty plug might cause rough running. Multiple fouled plugs could rob power, create misfires, increase stress, and make a pilot lose confidence before the wheels left the runway. Confidence mattered. A pilot who did not trust his engine was already carrying fear into the sky. The men on the ground understood this better than anyone. A bad spark plug was not always a catastrophe. Sometimes it was merely a warning. But warnings were not small things in aviation. They were the thin line before disaster became obvious. And sometimes obvious came too late. There were other parts like it. Magnetos, ignition leads, fuel pump seals, hydraulic fittings, bearings, brake parts, tires, oxygen regulators, carburetor components, small objects with unglamorous names, sitting in crates and drawers, waiting to become decisive. But the spark plug gives the story its shape because it was so ordinary. A man could hold it between two fingers. A missing bomber could not be held at all. That contrast was the heart of the matter. Modern war had trained people to look at the large object. The aircraft, the squadron, the formation, the base, the campaign. The small object disappeared because it seemed beneath the scale of events. Yet scale was deceptive. A bomber formation depended on thousands of correct details. Remove enough of them, and the formation became smaller. Remove more, and it became late. Remove still more, and it never formed. In maintenance tents and hangars, parts developed reputations. Some were hoarded. Some were cleaned and reused past comfort. Some were borrowed from one aircraft to save another. Mechanics learned which components failed under cold, which ones hated dust, which ones were officially available but never arrived when needed. A shortage rarely announced itself dramatically. It appeared first as irritation, then delay, then improvisation, then risk. At first, a crew chief might say, "We can clean these and get one more run." Then, "Pull the good ones from that aircraft." Then, "Mark this one down until supply catches up." Then, finally, silence because there was nothing left to say. They believed small parts were consumables. What really happened was that consumables became strategy. The sergeant in France had seen the drawer. Not empty, not yet, but low enough to make his stomach tighten. He knew how many engines were waiting. He knew how many aircraft had run rough in the cold. He knew the mission board would not shrink itself just because a tray of plugs had gone missing somewhere between depot and front. He also knew something else. If the squadron kept flying at this pace, the shortage would not stay hidden. It would show itself in the sky. The supply chain before the battle. Before a spare part reached a freezing airfield in France, it had already traveled through a war. It began far from the sound of artillery, in a factory where metal was shaped, inspected, boxed, labeled, and entered into a system too vast for any single man to fully see. From there it moved into crates, rail cars, warehouses, ships, ports, depots, trucks, and finally into the hands of someone who needed it immediately. Every step looked manageable on paper. Every step could fail. A crate might be delayed at a port. A label might be wrong. A convoy might be diverted. A ship might be sunk. A depot might have plenty of parts but not the right ones. A forward airfield might receive what it had requested 3 weeks too late, after the operational situation had changed completely. A box might arrive damaged, wet, crushed, or filled with components for a different model. No enemy fighter had to appear. Friction was enough. The Allied supply system, especially as the war moved into 1944, became one of the great hidden weapons of the conflict. It was not perfect. Men cursed it daily. But compared with the collapsing supply realities faced by Germany late in the war, it gave Allied air forces an advantage that went beyond numbers. It helped keep aircraft flying repeatedly, not merely existing. That distinction wore down the enemy in ways that were not always visible in battle reports. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, faced a tightening trap. Aircraft could still be produced. Skilled engineers still designed machines of great performance. Some German fighters remained dangerous to the end. But machines require more than design. They require fuel, pilots, replacement engines, tires, plugs, ammunition, trained mechanics, secure airfields, transport networks, and time. By 1944 and 1945, time itself had become scarce. Bombed rail lines slowed movement. Fuel shortages reduced training. Experienced mechanics were lost, transferred, exhausted, or working under worsening conditions. Aircraft stood dispersed under trees or hidden near damaged fields. The question was no longer simply whether Germany could build aircraft. It was whether those aircraft could be kept serviceable in sufficient numbers under relentless pressure. A fighter without fuel was silent. A fighter without parts was waiting to become a source of parts for another fighter. Cannibalization was not unique to one side. Every air force did it when necessary. But there was a difference between cannibalization as an emergency practice and cannibalization as a symptom of systemic collapse. On forward Allied fields, mechanics also robbed one machine to save another. They did it under pressure, often reluctantly. A grounded aircraft became a donor. Its good radio might go to one plane, its tire to another, its ignition parts to a third. The aircraft remained physically present, but its identity dissolved into the squadron. This was the strange arithmetic of maintenance. One dead machine could give life to several others. For a while. But cannibalization borrowed from the future. Eventually, the donor aircraft had to be rebuilt or written off. Eventually, the parts drawer had to be filled. Eventually, supply had to catch up with operations, or operations had to slow down. Commanders did not like slowing down. The front rarely allowed it. They believed logistics existed behind the battle. What really happened was that logistics arrived before the battle, shaped the battle, and sometimes decided the battle before the enemy was visible. On the morning of December 24th, the sergeant did what mechanics did across every air war theater. He looked at the aircraft that had to fly and the aircraft that probably would not. He made choices no speech would ever mention. One plug from here. One lead from there. Mark that aircraft unserviceable. Get this one running. Hurry. The sky was beginning to lighten. The crew chief who said no. The hardest word on an airfield was not always spoken by generals. Sometimes it came from a maintenance man standing beside an aircraft, looking at a pilot who wanted to go. No. It was a small word. Could sound disrespectful even when it was not. It could feel like cowardice to someone who did not understand the machine. It could anger an operations officer counting aircraft for a mission. It could shame a pilot who believed his place was with the others. But sometimes it was the only honest word left. The crew chief's authority was not theatrical. He did not command the squadron. He did not choose the target. He did not decide the campaign. His power existed in a narrow space, the condition of the aircraft placed in his care. Within that space, his judgment mattered more than rank could easily admit. He knew the aircraft's history. He knew what had been patched. He knew what had been delayed. He knew the difference between a defect that could wait and one that could kill. But pressure has its own weight. A pilot might say, "It sounded rough yesterday and still flew." An officer might say, "We need every ship." Another mechanic might say nothing, just glance toward the line, where engines were already starting. The crew chief had to answer not only the men in front of him, but the machine itself. Machines do not negotiate. They do not care about urgency. They do not respect courage. A plug fires or it does not. A seal holds or it leaks. A bearing survives or it begins to destroy itself. A cable moves freely or it binds. A tire holds pressure or it fails on takeoff. War is full of moral grayness, but metal can be brutally plain. The pilot in France was young enough to be impatient and experienced enough to be afraid of showing it. He had flown missions where flak came up like black flowers in the sky. He had seen aircraft disappear into clouds and never emerge. He had watched men return silent, climbing down from cockpits with faces aged by a single hour. He understood danger, but waiting on the ground was its own kind of humiliation. The crew chief could see it in him. The tight jaw, the gloved hand tapping against the helmet. The way his eyes moved from the engine to the other aircraft taxiing out. The sergeant removed another plug, inspected it and said quietly, "Not yet, not a speech, not drama, just 2 words." The pilot looked away. Across the field, an engine roared properly at last, rising from cough to power. Another followed. The sound rolled over the airstrip and made the grounded aircraft feel even more silent. They believed courage meant going. What really happened was that survival sometimes depended on the man willing to delay, refuse, and absorb the anger of those who could not see what he saw. Still, refusal had a cost. Every grounded aircraft meant fewer guns in the air, fewer bombs on target, fewer eyes over the front, fewer escorts for someone else. Saying no could save a pilot and endanger another. Saying yes could fill a formation and bury men in wreckage. The crew chief was not choosing between safety and duty. He was choosing between risks. And the war gave him minutes, not hours. One mission, one missing part. By 5:50, the field had become a machine of its own. Engines turned. Propellers blurred into pale discs. Men moved in practiced paths between wings and trucks, careful not to be struck by vehicles sliding over frozen ruts. The air smelled of exhaust, wet canvas, cold metal, and gasoline. Voices came through radios in fragments. A name, a number, a runway instruction. Static swallowed the rest. The squadron was supposed to launch as close to first light as possible. The weather, for once, was beginning to open. That made the pressure worse. For days, winter clouds had protected German movement in the Ardennes. When the sky cleared, Allied air power could return with force. Roads, bridges, columns, fuel trucks, railheads, all of them became targets. The men at the airfield knew this. They also knew that if they missed the window, others would pay for it. Infantry in the snow. Tank crews low on fuel. Convoys under threat. The war beyond the runway had no patience for a missing part. The sergeant had one aircraft ready after replacing and cleaning what he could. Another was doubtful. A third had been stripped for parts and would not fly that morning. On the mission board, that loss would become a mark. In the maintenance area, it was a body on the table giving up organs. A supply truck arrived just after 6. Men noticed it immediately. Mechanics always noticed supply trucks. The truck stopped near the store's tent, and 2 crates came down. One was ammunition-related. The other carried aircraft components, but not the ones most urgently needed. Someone had sent the wrong shipment, or the right shipment for yesterday's problem, or the right shipment for another unit entirely. No one had time to be properly angry. There is a kind of anger in war that has no place to go. It sits in the hands. It sharpens movements. Turns a wrench too hard. It makes men silent. The operations officer came down the line. He was not a villain. He had his own pressure. Somewhere above him, orders were being transmitted with the clean confidence of distance. The front needed support. The group needed numbers. The squadron had to contribute. How many? The answer was lower than expected. The officer looked toward the grounded aircraft. Can that one be made ready? The sergeant did not need to ask which one. He looked at the fighter. He looked at the pilot. He looked at the engine panel still open in the cold light. Maybe, he said. Maybe was one of the most dangerous words on an airfield. Could mean almost ready. Could mean not ready at all. It could mean the mechanic did not want to say no until he had tried everything left. They worked fast now. A plug was pulled from the donor aircraft. Another cleaned. Leads checked. Connections tightened. The pilot climbed in and waited while the sergeant stood clear. The starter engaged. The propeller turned slowly, then faster. The engine caught. For a few seconds, it sounded good. Then came the roughness again, faint but present, like a limp in a man trying to run. The pilot looked down from the cockpit. The sergeant listened. Every man nearby seemed to freeze, though the engine was shaking the air around them. The belief was that the enemy would decide the mission. What really happened was that the decision rested in the sound of an engine at idle, and in the face of one mechanic who knew the sound was wrong. He raised his hand. Cut it. The engine died. And in the sudden quiet, the squadron began to taxi without them. When air power became a numbers game, the aircraft that left the ground that morning did not look like a partial force to the men watching from below. They looked powerful. Engines climbed into the cold. Wings lifted. The formation gathered itself and moved toward the front, shrinking into the pale distance. For a moment, the old image of air power returned. Machines rising together, war carried into the sky by speed and fire. But there were gaps. Not large enough for a newspaper headline. Not dramatic enough for a newsreel. Just fewer aircraft than planned. A slightly thinner formation. One less pair of guns. One less pilot over the target. One less bomb load. One less chance. That was how readiness shaped war, not always through catastrophe but through subtraction. A squadron did not need to be destroyed to be weakened. It could be reduced by weather, by fatigue, by damage, by accidents, by parts shortages, by fuel rationing, by maintenance hours that could not be compressed any further. The enemy might claim aircraft in combat. The system claimed aircraft before combat began. This was especially brutal because air war depended on tempo. One mission mattered, but repeated missions mattered more. The The side that could generate sorties again and again could apply pressure relentlessly. It could return tomorrow and the next day and the day after. Could punish movement, isolate battlefields, disrupt supply, and exhaust defenders. The side that could not keep aircraft serviceable lost more than machines. It lost rhythm. Late in the war, German air power suffered this truth with increasing severity. Pilots still fought. Mechanics still worked. Aircraft still flew. But the system around them was under attack from every direction. Fuel shortages, bombed infrastructure, dispersed production, strained transport, limited training, and parts that did not arrive in time or in sufficient quantity. A fighter might be technically advanced and still unavailable. A jet might promise speed and still sit waiting for fuel, trained pilots, or serviceable components. A squadron might exist on paper while its actual strength withered in the mud. For the Allies, the opposite lesson became a weapon. Their advantage was not only that they produced aircraft in huge numbers. It was that they built the repair, supply, depot, transport, and maintenance systems that allowed aircraft to keep flying. Imperfectly, under strain, often with improvisation, but at a scale the enemy could not match. This did not make the work easy. It made the work decisive. The tiny spare part became part of a larger equation. Plug did not win the war. Neither did a bearing, a tire, a gasket, a magneto, or a hydraulic fitting. But without them, the aircraft that did win battles never arrived. There is a temptation to imagine war as a contest of spectacular moments. Dogfights, bombing runs, flak bursts, explosions, victory rolls. Those moments mattered. Men died in them. History turned on some of them. But many spectacular moments were made possible by unspectacular success. The engine started. The wheel held. The radio worked. The oxygen flowed. The guns fired. The aircraft returned. Then it was repaired and sent again. They believed air combat began when enemies met. What really happened was that air combat had already been narrowed, shaped, and sometimes decided by availability, by maintenance, by parts, by the number of aircraft that could actually answer when called. On the field in France, the grounded pilot watched the formation disappear. He was alive because the crew chief had said no. Someone else, somewhere ahead, would face the sky with one fewer aircraft beside him. That was the cruelty of the equation. No answer was clean. The mathematics of survival. Numbers can make war seem colder than it is. But sometimes numbers reveal the thing emotion hides. Imagine a squadron assigned 24 aircraft. On a planning board, that number has weight. 24 aircraft can cover ground. 24 aircraft can escort, strike, patrol, or defend. 24 aircraft can reassure a commander reading reports miles behind the line. Now remove 3 for scheduled maintenance. Remove 2 for battle damage from the previous day. Remove 1 for a tire failure. Remove another for radio trouble. Remove 2 for ignition problems waiting on parts. The squadron still exists. This designation has not changed. This commander is still responsible for the same war. But the number that matters is no longer 24. It is 16, or 15, or less. The difference is not administrative. It is physical. Fewer aircraft means less coverage, shorter endurance over the target, weaker escort, fewer weapons delivered, fewer eyes watching roads, fewer chances to absorb losses. It also means the aircraft that do fly are used harder, which creates more wear, which creates more maintenance, which increases dependence on parts that may already be short. The equation feeds itself. That is what made small components so powerful. Their value was not their manufacturing cost. Their value was what they unlocked. A spark plug was inexpensive compared with an aircraft engine. An engine was inexpensive compared with the trained pilot and combat mission it carried. The aircraft was inexpensive compared with the strategic result expected from the sortie. A tiny part could sit at the bottom of a chain of value so large that its absence became absurd. A cheap missing part could waste an expensive aircraft. A delayed crate could weaken a mission. A grounded aircraft could alter the risk faced by crews already in the air. Some records from wartime maintenance systems suggest enormous numbers of man-hours were required to keep aircraft operational. especially heavy bombers and high-performance fighters under combat conditions. Verify the exact figure varied by aircraft, theater, weather, mission type, and intensity of operations. What matters is not a single number. What matters is the pattern. Flight was the visible tip of a much larger labor system. 1 hour in the air could demand many hours on the ground. The public saw the hour. The war depended on the hours no one saw. And those hours were not just mechanical. They were emotional. Men worked knowing that a missed defect might kill someone they knew. A loose connection, a rushed inspection, a reused part that should have been replaced. These were not abstract errors. They had faces attached to them. The mathematics of survival also worked against the enemy. If bombing damaged rail lines, parts slowed. If parts slowed, maintenance suffered. If maintenance suffered, readiness fell. If readiness fell, fewer aircraft flew. If fewer aircraft flew, the enemy gained more freedom to bomb again. Logistics failure became a spiral. This was why Allied attacks on fuel, transport, and industry mattered so deeply. A fighter shot down was one loss. A supply network disrupted could ground many. They believed the dramatic kill was the center of air war. What really happened was that attrition also moved through warehouses, depots, rail yards, fuel dumps, and maintenance tents. On the French field, the sergeant did not speak in equations. He did not need to. He had a simpler version in front of him. One plug, one aircraft, one missing place in the formation, one pilot alive and angry on the ground. And somewhere ahead, a fight that would not wait for perfect numbers. The men left behind and the men sent anyway. There were many kinds of silence on an airfield. The silence before engines started. The silence after a crash. The silence of men waiting for aircraft to return. And the smaller silence of a pilot who had been told he would not fly. He might feel relief first, then shame for feeling it, then anger because shame needs somewhere to go. He might tell himself the mechanic was too cautious. He might stare at the aircraft as if willpower could repair it. He might walk away without speaking because anything he said would sound wrong. The crew chief felt none of that cleanly. He had kept the pilot alive, perhaps. Or he had grounded an aircraft that might have helped others. He had followed judgment, but judgment did not erase consequence. War rarely offered the comfort of knowing which lives had been saved and which had been placed at greater risk. The formation that departed without them went toward its own danger. German flak did not care that maintenance had been difficult. Weather did not care that parts were short. Enemy fighters, when they appeared, did not reduce their attack because a squadron had launched under strength. The men in the air carried the absence of the grounded aircraft whether they knew it or not. A missing escort could matter. A missing reconnaissance aircraft could matter. A missing fighter bomber over a road at the right minute could matter. This is where the tiny part touched human cost. Not in theory, in exposure. For bomber crews, insufficient escort could mean longer minutes under attack. For troops on the ground, delayed air support could mean enemy movement unpunished. For pilots flying with a rough engine because no replacement part was available, the cost might come as a sudden loss of power over hostile territory, with fields below too small, too muddy, too full of trees, or too close to enemy lines. Mechanics carried these possibilities in ways that were difficult to explain. They were not the ones in the cockpit, yet they were never separate from the cockpit. When an aircraft failed to return, ground crews often searched memory for anything they might have missed. Was the engine note different? Was that oil stain larger than it looked? Did the pilot mention a vibration? Was the repair good enough? Was good enough the same as safe? No official form could fully contain that burden. A maintenance report might say, aircraft unserviceable. A loss report might say, failed to return. A readiness chart might show percentages. But the airfield knew names. It knew which bunk was empty, which tools belonged to which man, which pilot always joked before takeoff and which one became quiet, which mechanic kept working after bad news because stopping would make him think. They believed the cost of war was paid mainly in combat. What really happened was that some of the cost gathered before combat, in decisions made beside silent aircraft. The sergeant in France watched the sky after the formation left. The pilot stood nearby for a while, then removed his gloves slowly, as if the morning had no more use for urgency. Neither man said much. There was still work to do. The grounded aircraft had to be repaired. The donor aircraft had to be marked. The stores had to be checked again. Requests had to be sent up the line, where they would become paperwork, then movement, then perhaps a crate arriving too late or just in time. And later, when aircraft returned, some would need patching. Some would need plugs. Some would need engines. Some would not return at all. The war on the ground never ended when the squadron took off. It waited for the survivors. The invisible victory of maintenance. After the war, aircraft became legends. The names were easy to remember. Spitfire, Mustang, Thunderbolt, Lightning, Lancaster, Flying Fortress, Liberator, Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, Zero. They had silhouettes that belonged to history. They carried national memory on their wings. Museums preserved them under polished light. Children learned their shapes before they learned the systems that kept them flying. Pilots wrote memoirs. Commanders defended decisions. Battles were mapped and remapped. Ground crews appeared in the margins. A photograph here. Caption there. A veteran standing beside a machine remembered mostly for the man who flew it. This imbalance was understandable. Combat in the air was dramatic, visible, terrifying. Pilots faced death in a way that demanded attention. But attention can distort truth when it forgets the conditions that made combat possible. Post-war air forces did not forget. They studied readiness. They studied maintenance flow. They studied spare parts distribution, depot repair, engine life, sortie generation, turnaround time, and the relationship between logistics and combat power. The lesson was not sentimental. It was institutional. Machines needed systems. Systems needed parts. Parts needed transport. Transport needed protection. And all of it needed people trained to notice failure before it became fatal. Modern air forces inherited this truth from World War II. An aircraft's performance mattered. But so did maintainability. So did standardization. So did supply depth. So did documentation. So did the ability to repair under field conditions in bad weather with exhausted people and imperfect information. The tiny part had become doctrine, though no one would phrase it that way. There was also recognition, but often late and quiet. Veterans of maintenance units knew what they had done. Pilots knew too, sometimes more deeply than public memory did. Many aircrew trusted their crew chiefs with a kind of respect that needed no ceremony. Before a mission, a glance from a mechanic could mean more than an order from above. After a mission, returning to the same ground crew meant returning to men who would look at the machine without illusion. They would see every hole, every leak, every stain, every sign that the aircraft had survived by luck, design, skill, and the stubborn labor of hands on metal. The enemy understood the same truth in defeat. Reports, diaries, and post-war accounts from various air forces repeatedly pointed toward the brutal importance of fuel, parts, maintenance, and trained ground personnel. Verify air forces did not collapse only when their aircraft were shot from the sky. They weakened when the machinery beneath flight could no longer sustain the tempo demanded by war. They believed victory in the air belonged only to those who fought in the air. What really happened was that victory also belonged to men who never crossed the front line, yet touched the aircraft before every mission and after every return. The sergeant in France would not become famous. The pilot he grounded might never thank him properly. The missing part would not be displayed in a museum with a dramatic label. The mourning would disappear into the routine records of a large war. But the truth remained. A grounded aircraft is not a small event to the men who need it. And a working aircraft is not a miracle. It is the result of 1,000 small things not failing at once. The war inside the machine. By afternoon, the airfield had changed color. The hard blue-gray of morning gave way to a flat winter light. Snow near the maintenance area had turned black with oil and footprints. The tracks of trucks crossed and recrossed until the ground looked worked over by something heavy and tired. Men moved slower now, not because the urgency had passed, but because urgency had become normal. The aircraft that had been grounded before dawn still sat with its panels open. The sergeant returned to it after other work pulled him away. He had eaten something without tasting it. He had signed forms. He had checked other engines. He had watched returning aircraft land one by one, counting without meaning to count. Some came back damaged. Some came back clean. Some did not come back at all. No one on the field needed to say much about that. The absence was enough. He picked up the failed plug again. By then it had lost even the small drama it had carried in the morning. It was just a part on a workbench. Darkened metal. Stained ceramic. Evidence of stress, heat, use, and timing. The kind of object history usually misses. And yet, inside that object was a lesson modern war taught again and again. Power is never as simple as it looks from a distance. A squadron is not only aircraft. It is pilots and mechanics, fuel and weather, tools and training, depots and trucks, clerks and crates, factory tolerances and field improvisations. It is confidence and doubt. It is the decision to fly and sometimes the harder decision not to. World War II forced every air force to confront this. The side that could replace losses, repair damage, deliver parts, train crews, protect supply lines, and keep aircraft serviceable gained something deeper than numbers. It gained endurance. It gained tempo. It gained the ability to return. Again and again. The side that lost that ability could still possess brave pilots and dangerous machines. But bravery could not fill a fuel tank. Skill could not replace a missing bearing. Desperation could not make a cracked component whole. A commander could order aircraft into the air, but he could not command a dead engine to trust him. That was the war inside the machine. Quiet, technical, human, unforgiving. The public memory of air war will always belong partly to the sky, because the sky is where the drama becomes visible. Fighters diving through cloud. Bombers holding formation through flak. Tracers rising. Engines burning. Men making decisions in seconds. But before all of that, there was the ground. The cold morning. The open cowling. The mechanic's hand. The small part held close to a flashlight while the mission clock moved forward. They believed air power was measured by the number of aircraft a nation could build, the speed of its fighters, the range of its bombers, and the courage of the men who flew them. But what really happened was harder, quieter, and more exacting. Air power lived or died in readiness. And sometimes readiness came down to a tiny spare part, small enough to fit in a palm, important enough to hold an entire squadron on the ground. Final CTA. If you watched this far, tell us where you are watching from. And if someone in your family served in the war, in the air, on the ground, in a factory, in a hospital, or in a role history rarely names, share their story in the comments. These forgotten details are part of the larger truth of World War II. Subscribe to WW2 Combat Files for more stories about what they believed and what really happened.